Hello, good afternoon. Hi, I'm Chase Winder. I'm the State Program Director with Graduation Alliance. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm really excited to introduce our panelists today and our topic. We're here today to talk about how we are linking dropout rates of high school students across the state to economic efforts, helping them to find education, training, and ultimately good employment throughout the state. This is not just a problem here in Texas, but nationwide. While the graduation rates are steadily increasing across the board, there's still millions and millions of students that are being left behind with not as many opportunities, pathways to find really the skills, the education, and that second chance to being able to be in the workforce and be a productive person in society, and going on to post-secondary options, employment, and even the armed forces. So really excited about the topic here today and our panelists. I wanted to introduce on my left Representative Huberty. He serves in Texas District 127 since 2011. He's been named to several highly respected committees across the state, including public education, state affairs, redistricting, and transportation funding. He's played a significant role in the development of public education legislation, including the Foundation High School program, which altered state graduation requirements and placed greater emphasis on career preparation. His committee assignments and legislative efforts are indicative of his background in education. He served on the Humboldt ISD School Board for 5 years prior to serving in the legislature. Thank you. On his left is Greg Vaughn, the Executive Director of the Texas Association of Workforce Boards. Greg is the director of a not-for-profit association that's representing the local workforce development boards in Texas and more than 750 of the business, education, and community leaders who serve on those boards. Thanks for being here, Greg. We have Drew Sheberly next to him, who's the Senior Vice President of Education and Talent Development for the Austin Chamber of Commerce. Drew has been working on education and talent development for the Austin Chamber. Among his achievements is his development and oversight of the 2010 and 2010 initiative to increase higher education enrollment in Austin by 30% in 48 months. Throughout his distinguished career, Drew has established himself as a not-for-profit education leader at the national, state, and local levels, as well as a successful legislative advocate. Thank you guys for joining us here today.
You bet.
Wanted to jump into our first topic today of the impact dropouts are having. As I mentioned, the United States has made strides and has raised the nationwide level of graduation rates to 81%. While this is great news, it still means that 1 in 5 K-12 age students are dropping out of school every year. And according to the American Community Survey in Texas, there is now 3.5 million youth and adults who do not have a high school diploma in this state. So I wanted to ask the panelists, what sort of impact does this continual challenge of graduating all students have on our communities, and what is your organization doing about this issue? Representative?
Okay. Obviously, in Texas, we've seen some really good data as of late. We're number 2 as of last year. We were number 2 to Utah in graduation. So some of the things we've done over the last several years have made a huge impact. The implementation of HB5 that creates a path for students that creates a base foundation program, then obviously an enhanced program above and beyond that. But I think over the last 6 years, at least as long as I've been in the legislature, one of the things that we looked at is said, career and technical education is critical, right? I think we all believe that, from a business perspective. And there's plenty of jobs that are going unfilled out there by a skilled workforce. And so I think there was this push for many years that everybody needs to be college ready and they need to go to college after they get out of school. Well, a lot of kids aren't going to do that. And so we recognize how important that is. And so I think partnerships with the community colleges have been important at school districts. That's made a huge impact where you're able to get kids out with a certificate degree and a degree that actually lets them go do something and earn a living. That's important. So as we continue to watch this program incubate especially with the implementation of HB5. I think that that's going to be a very important tool to continue to see the graduation rates continue to rise. And, I met with some people at your guys' association this morning, and we were talking about it and saying, there's 467,000 kids of basically high school age that are dropping out. We've got to figure out a way to rescue those kids, because the reality is the stats show that, they're going to live, in poverty. 95% of them will live in poverty if we don't do something about it. And so I think a lot of the things we're doing is making a huge impact as we continue to go forward. So I know school districts I represent have taken that on, especially on the career and technical education side.
Thank you. Greg, why don't you answer that question as well and introduce us a little bit to your organization?
Okay, thank you. Well, is this on? Working? Well, we're very pleased to be here today. The Texas Association of Workforce Boards, as you mentioned, is comprised of the 28 local workforce development boards in Texas. I don't know, by a show of hands, who all has ever heard of a local workforce development board? Oh, all right. Well, we do have a few. I'm pleased. Well, as you know, these are the organizations, and as you mentioned, that are comprised of business leaders and community leaders serving on those boards. In fact, by law, 50% of the board's composition has to be business people. So those are the people who are working with our organization. And 2 years ago, we published an education paper entitled "The Workforce in Texas: Aligning Education to Meet the Needs of Texas Employers." And based upon the input and the research, from our members, really the basic premise of that paper is that if we don't begin to make some serious changes to our educational system, that we're going to have some serious problems, down the road, if we're going to continue to thrive. If the Texas economy is going to continue to thrive. You talked about some of the statistics you threw out, and there are numerous ones out there about while we have made strides, there's still far too many areas where Texas ranks near the bottom, both in terms of our literacy levels and in terms of the number of high school graduates that we're producing and those that have some sort of post-secondary certification in order to be workforce ready. So essentially, part of that paper that we did, and we can go into detail on this later, and I encourage everyone to visit our website and take a look at it. But really, our organization and those business leaders have recommended that we continue, educational reform efforts, which are really based on what we would call the pre-K to careers model, and also developing more, business partnerships and a business-driven education system, again, to meet the needs of employers. The workforce system as a whole and our boards really function to serve, our customers are businesses in Texas and Texas employers. So again, based upon, those realities, we feel like it has a huge impact on us right now, and it's something we're going to need to continue to work on very hard.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts. Drew, how about the chamber?
You bet. So the Austin Chamber has 3,000 business members here in Austin, and our goal is to make sure that employers can hire and power growth in their companies. So the Austin market had by far the largest increase in job growth year over year at about 4.7%. It was a full percentage point higher than anyone else in that top 50 market. This is a high skill economy, and you can look at the job openings as of February 13th. We had 43,000 job openings. Half of those require a bachelor's degree. About another 15% require an associate's degree. We had 32,000 people unemployed, and about 60-70% of those lack an associate's degree. So it's very difficult in this economy if you don't have a degree, and so it's a real challenge for us. Our workforce board, to their credit, by the end of August is supposed to have a regional workforce plan that can make a meaningful reduction in unemployment and also look at the training for people that are unemployed. We spend about $17 million a year, city, county, workforce board, and so we get around 300 certifications. That's not good math. It's about 56,000 a certification. So that's one of the big things we need to do is get more lift out of existing dollars. Maybe one way to do that also is to change the composition a little bit further within and have even more of a business presence on workforce boards to have more of a business-minded outlook on that. But in this market, at least, you need a credential and you need a diploma. You need a college diploma to be able to live.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'll back up a little bit. I got so excited introducing you guys and your organizations. Graduation Alliance is working across the country to help provide alternative education options for these dropout students. A lot of these students are dropping out for reasons that are other than academic. It's life circumstances. It may be bullying, social and emotional issues, traumatic experiences, pregnant and parenting. And so our organization helps partner in various communities to offer an alternative pathway for students to get their high school diploma with a lot of wraparound support so that they can kind of get back on track in their life and be able to go into a community college, to be able to go into a job training program and help meet businesses and employers' needs from both a soft skills and a hard skills perspective. So thank you so much for your insight into that issue. The next topic for the panelists is on obtaining employment. So according to national statistics, today in the United States there are 33 million Americans without a high school credential. It's almost about 10% of the total population. And research shows, to your point, that in 29% of low-income families, at least one parent does not hold a high school diploma and are therefore unable to attain employment and family providing wages for them. So I wanted to go down and ask the panelists, how does this national challenge impact your organizations and your constituents in the state of Texas? Representative?
Well, for those who are not from Texas, do or do not know this, we serve once every 2 years. We're in a 2-year legislative body, so we have to have real jobs for a living. And I can tell you the impact that I've seen from a business perspective has been significant. People that don't qualify or can't get the job or don't have degrees. I mean, in my past life when I worked for big corporations, that was a requirement, and so that was always an impact. So, the connection that you have to have from the business community to the school districts and to the schools to get educated people is going to be critical, and the support that has to be there for that. And then the constituency level, depending on where you live, I'm a suburban member of the House of Representatives, but nonetheless, we also have, surprisingly, about a 50% economically disadvantaged population within the district I represent. So it's real life examples of that happening in our community. Surprisingly, I think one of the stats that I saw on this is that of the people that not getting the GEDs, proportionately, and are trying to go back into school, about 70% of that population are single moms. And that's a population base that is critical because we've seen that time and time again, and that's where the being able to interact with those students, when that life-altering event happens with them, if they're having a baby or something, to be able to capture them at the school and figure out how do we let them graduate. One of the things we did last session is making sure that we find at-risk campuses like the Wyndham School. We allowed the Wyndham School last session. I worked with Senator Seliger on this to be able to pass a bill that allows the Wyndham School to actually offer graduation diplomas. That's a huge impact, when you're graduating and you're getting a diploma versus, a GED. Maybe you might get your GED, maybe you don't, but that's the highest at-risk population of people that we have out there, of students that we have out there. So that is significant that we have to do that. So we have to start there, and we've seen an increase in the graduation rates, about 88% right now across the state, and we have to continue to work on that. So I see it and hear it all the time from my constituents and certainly in the workforce.
Yeah, that makes sense. Greg?
Well, certainly when you're talking about adult adult education and adults who have dropped out of school, that has a huge impact on the workforce system. A large part of what our workforce system does through the Texas Workforce Commission is, of course, they are the ones who are in charge of delivering adult basic education services in the state of Texas. And of course, adult basic education really comprised of those programs designed for someone to get a GED and English as a second language programs. Those are the first steps to workforce readiness. We talked about the importance of earning a post-secondary degree or post-secondary credential. Well, first steps first. And the first things we have to do is get people workforce ready. And so the adult basic education programs, which are a large part of what the boards do and what the workforce system delivers, have a huge impact. Along those lines, I would encourage everyone that that there are a lot of positive things happening. I think we talked about again, the name of our paper, aligning education to meet the needs of this workforce. I think that's a concept that is really catching on among government agencies and educational institutions across the board. I think we saw that even with the Texas legislature transferring responsibility for adult basic education from the Texas Education Agency to the Texas Workforce Commission in 2013. So I think those are all strides, and I know that with the leadership of Chairman Alcantara at the Texas Workforce Commission, that he is working much more closely with Commissioner Paredes of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and has working closely also with the new director of the Texas Education Agency. These are all issues that I know in his remarks to us and his work with our boards that are front and center with them, and I think the alignment that is occurring just within the agencies themselves with this, again, the focus being how are we serving the employers out there? I mean, it benefits certainly the job seeker, but what is the product that our employers need out there? That's become a focus. And I will also add that with the federal legislation of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, you're also seeing, I think, more of an emphasis. They've really copied what the state of Texas has been doing for years, but with these changes, you're seeing more of an emphasis in terms of streamlining all of these services that have an impact on the person's ability to get training, to hold a job, and to have access to those opportunities. So all of this is coming together in a big way, and I think the final piece of that is one of the things when we're talking about alignment and collaboration is that we need to, although we're certainly the boards, that's a bigger requirement for them under the Workforce and Innovation Opportunity Act, but also what we can do to further facilitate this three-legged stool of education, workforce development, and economic development, working hand in hand, to achieve common outcomes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Drew, what does some of that product look like from the employment perspective with some of the folks coming into the workforce?
Yeah, so Austin as a market, about a quarter of the folks moving here in working age population have a master's degree or higher. And then we have probably about the same number coming here with very little to no education. So one have lots of prospects that pay very little. One have lots of prospects that pay a lot. For those that are not skilled, right, it's just really challenging in this market to earn enough without getting a certification. And so, we need a workforce system that's going to produce more outcomes, have a bigger impact on scale. Legislature might want to look at putting additional weighted funding around some of the high-need programs. Nursing is our single biggest occupation. We have 1,900 vacancies right now in Austin, and we don't have the ability to scale that up because it's very expensive to provide that. So targeting some very specific ways of helping to move people into nursing programs. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,000 jobs that are open in network administrator positions where you don't necessarily need an associate's degree, but again, it's expensive to offer, and the way in which we charge everybody the same amount of money for a community college class, whether it's a nursing class or whether it's a jewelry class, or whether it's a remedial academic class. So some of that pricing stuff can be addressed by the legislature and can help transition more people into some high-need areas. The other area that we've got a significant number of vacancies on, where you might see a very short, intense program, is first-line managers for retail, where it's not going to be a huge paycheck, but there are tons of opportunities in a state growing like Texas, and where we just have a huge number of opportunities for folks that don't have all the skills starting out.
Yeah, that's great. And that actually kind of leads us into our next topic on middle skill level jobs. According to the National Skills Coalition, recently published a study that indicates that middle skill jobs, which require beyond high school but not necessarily a 4-year degree, make up the largest part of America's labor market. Currently, 54% of all jobs in the U.S. are mid-skill level, with the expectation that in the next 10 years, more than 50% of all new jobs created will be in the middle skill area as well. Yet they report that only 44% of the country's workers are trained middle skill level and can access this stream of jobs. And Drew, I'll maybe turn it back to you and ask you, maybe dovetailing on your comments, but what else do you think we can do to improve the workforce readiness of possibly those folks as well as those that maybe have dropped out of high school and do not yet have those credentialing, and maybe any initiatives that
Sure. So I want to give you a strange answer. We tax property very highly in this state. So manufacturing is just difficult to attract into this state because of how high we tax property. So unless you're making a major CapEx in Texas, you're paying full boat on property taxes, and those kinds of middle school manufacturing jobs are harder to come by. So looking at a more competitive property tax rate will help us to be more competitive in these kind of manufacturing jobs. Now, beyond that, you're looking really at service economy type support jobs by and large, and there are training efforts that can happen, but Texas has never really put a lot of money into training. And so, it's something that you can look at some other states and you can see a whole lot more focus on middle skills training. We've basically put it into generically community college, a little bit into technical college, and I think some of what TSTC's been doing has been intriguing in a financing mechanism. But we really need to look at the formula funding related to training and community colleges if we want to be able to move more into these open positions. Last thing I'd say, this market is one of the few in the United States where the per capita income is going up. In most of the United States, per capita income has been going down since the early 70s. So middle skill is still losing ground. The only ones that are gaining ground are the higher skill jobs. And so that's. Do
you have some states that are examples of that model for funding for middle skill training?
I think you can look at Kentucky, Tennessee as two right off the top of your head.
Greg, you look ready to jump in there?
Well, sure. Well, I agree with what Drew was saying about these middle skill jobs and the challenges that we have there. Again, it's a growing opportunity. As we talked about before, so many of these positions and the industries that we want to recruit to Texas that are providing these jobs, they don't require necessarily a 4-year degree, but they do require some sort of post-secondary education, whether that's an associate's degree or whether that's an industry certification. One of the things that we've recommended very specifically that I think as it relates to middle skill jobs is expanded utilization of, as best we can, beginning in middle school, of career and technical education, like Drew was talking about. And the reasons for this is not just simply because something targeted towards those industries, but back to your point about dropouts, CTE classes, it's been proven, research has shown that students who are enrolled in CTE are, many times more likely not to drop out. High-risk students are more likely not to drop out if they're enrolled in CTE classes. We've also showed, too, that when we're talking about going on to post-secondary credentials, that students enrolled in CTE are more likely to do that as opposed to those who are not. Some other specific programs with regard to middle skill jobs is we're always for increased utilization as best we can of not only CTE in middle schools, but also apprenticeships, companies being able to provide internships, providing incentives for them to do so, expanded use of dual credit, early college, high school, all of these things which, in my opinion, which help students, get a feel for the working world out there. Last week, the executive director of our Greater Dallas Workforce Board, Lori Larea, was actually testifying at a House Ways and Means Committee subcommittee, and she said a very interesting thing. She said, work teaches work. And I think that's what we're going to get to. Beyond the benefits of the skills that these students are learning, they're also learning the communications and the professional skills that they need, that they can only get by being in a work environment. And I think also, as much as we can do to expose students, through these programs I've talked about, or through, employers providing opportunities for students and groups to tour their facilities, and for the employers also to go into the schools and make presentations to students. I think as much as we can do to give students, that hands-on, that, more than just, kick the tires, but ride around in the car a little bit, I think encourages them to permanently be a part of the workforce and to see the advantages that offers to them.
And real quick, Greg, would you describe the Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act emphasis on the out-of-school youth and also the work-based learning and how that translates at the local level into opportunities?
Well, as you said, the new, WIOA puts more emphasis, on out-of-school youth. And again, so that's, I think, an opportunity for us, and I think that relates back to also what the boards do with a lot of the adult basic education classes too. In terms of, and I'm sorry, what was the second part of that question?
The work-based learning, the 20% emphasis on that, and if
there is, one of the main things WIOA, as we call it, provides you to do is a lot of flexibility in terms of what you can do with these various funding streams and how you can meet them, utilize them to meet local needs. And so a lot of that is, I think, one of the, when you talk about work-based learnings, I think that's one of the basic tenets of what they're looking at. When they finally came up, with the reauthorization of this act. I think another big part of that too is we talked about the partnerships and forming these in business engagement. So I think that ties hand in hand with the work-based learning opportunities that they want to be able to, allow businesses to be able to, again, provide more apprenticeships, hire more interns on a statewide, basis. I know one of the recommendations we're looking at, I think there was a bill introduced last session that didn't quite make it, which I believe would have offered employers a franchise tax. Yes, thank you. Franchise tax rebate if they hired interns. I think it was about $1,000 per student who successfully completed the program. These are the types of things I think we need to look at in Texas that, again, will lead to more work-based opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Representative Huberty, what are some things the state can do to help address the middle skill level jobs and a lot of the available potential workforce out there and to help them with training opportunities?
Well, I think you need to bifurcate the issue from high school students or youth that would be graduating from high school theoretically within a 5-year period of time, and then your adult learners, I suppose. We've done a lot of work over the last several sessions on the career and technical education front, recognizing that we're trying to get skilled workforces out there. And the beauty of it is that there's whether it's working in the auto field or the hygiene, dental hygienist or something along those lines, depending on how you want to classify the middle skilled worker. Theoretically, those should be, entry-level jobs for them so they can work their way up through the ranks to have a more highly skilled job. within the next 10 or 15 years. And, the hope is that they're going to, continue education. Drew mentioned something about, community colleges and how they, how they try and make it affordable for everybody. And maybe there are some ways that you can weight that, but it's all about money. It's a money issue. We've got X amount of dollars that are allocated into the education system. 55% of all the dollars we spend from general revenue is spent on either K-12 or community colleges or higher education. That's a significant amount of money. When you start talking about, the state budget of the state of Texas, it's billions and billions of dollars. So, because if you input it into one area and increase it, you're going to take it away from another area, right? Theoretically, based on what you're talking about. So, those are some things that, we tried really hard from a legislative perspective. But the idea is like, giving businesses a credit, for implementing programs for interns and bring them in. Great ideas. Obviously those are. I remember the bill, and it's it's one of those that gets done late in the game, and so it can't get over the finish line. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 sessions to get things done. That's just the reality of the world that we live in, and so it takes a while for us to be able to do that. But the reality is, one of the things that we're going to be dealing with this next session is that we've got school finance. The school finance system in the state of Texas is broken. I mean, it's just broken. And it's been broken for years. And it was, tried to be fixed in 2006, when we gave property tax relief, theoretically. And, obviously then the appraisals have gone up. So, there's a twofold problem in the state when you talk about not getting jobs in here and stuff like that, is that, the appraisal system's broken as well. We've dealt with some of that last session, but we have to continue working on that. But we've got to fix the finance piece of that. And nobody ever thought 30 years ago that how are you going to weight career and technical education in the skilled workforce setting, and and trying to identify where do you need to be able to put those dollars. So those are some of the things that we're going to deal with next session. That's going to be very important. And then dealing with the community colleges and how they get funded, because they do train a lot of those workers, and that's going to be important. So those are all things like that will be on the table next session.
Yeah, that makes sense. Drew, what recommendations does the chamber have going into the next session on these topics?
Sure. So we have modest expectations on accountability, honestly, but I think on workforce, our biggest challenge here is computer programmers. So 20% of our open jobs, almost 10,000 jobs, are in IT. And if you look at the number of graduates from high school, only 2% of the graduates from Central Texas have taken even one computer science class. So if they reclassify computer science as a career and technical education class, we weight our funding, to be arcane about it, we weight our funding for things that cost more. Certainly if everybody's got to have a computer, that costs more. If you have smaller classes, that costs more. So reclassifying it as a CTE class will help provide a financial incentive for school districts to offer it. Second is we've got, there's folks like Kevin Wang in this room who are out there promoting student enrollment in it and having business people help train math and science teachers in the course. But we just don't have a lot of computer programmers in the private sector, much less teaching students. So that would be a second area that I'd look at. I'd look at the higher ed weighting formulas. I think that's an area where the state can help prioritize certain training that can help fill workforce needs. And I would look at the outcomes of our workforce system. And I think I'd say the governor deserves a lot of credit for his call earlier this week to have his 3 commissioners really focusing on workforce outcomes and aligning the system a little bit better. But this is an area that's very arcane, but where information can really influence behaviors. Imagine if you want to get on a flight to India in 6 hours, you've got all this information that you need, but how many websites do you need to go to, or how many books do you have to pull off a shelf if you want to know what the detailed work analysis for this job is, how that matches with courses in your area college, and how that matches with what you've learned already in high school. These are all things that could be known, and I think under the governor's leadership will become known, and I think that could be a huge help to the citizens of the state.
Yeah, Greg, as far as you and some of your members, what are some legislative initiatives and recommendations y'all are developing?
Well, we're just now beginning the process of taking a look at what policy recommendations, we might make. I think in addition to those things that I've already brought up, with always any types of legislation which, help or facilitate expanded use of CTE in middle schools, and as I also mentioned before, things which allow for more dual credit. We're always trying to encourage. I talked about the work teaches work. Career exploration is something that I think is also key, in this process, and we certainly would like to see opportunities for, more opportunities for students at an earlier age to be able to explore different career options. Meaning, what they pay, what are the career paths leading to, getting that job. As part of that too, I think, we need more, career counselors in school. I mean, teachers already have the hardest job in schools, but I think counselors, it might be even a little tougher. Even now with HB5, career counselors have a huge job. So we probably need more of them, for one thing, but also, anything that we can do to try to support their efforts, because it is so critically important that at an earlier age that, we can try to, infuse some of this into, the information or the curriculum, that our students, are receiving. I know it's getting, as Representative Huberty mentioned, everything has to be, in terms of the finances, it has to be taken into account. But I know one of the things that we think should at least be considered or looked into is the fact that we talked about adult basic education programs in the state, and my understanding is, at least through our latest papers, that Texas was one of only 2 states that was only putting up, the minimum required that is required by the federal government to receive those grants, and I believe that's like 25%. So, I'm not saying necessarily, but it might merit some consideration to looking into what would be maybe some of the cost, benefits if it were the state to invest more in its match of adult basic education programs, and how that would translate into, more people, particularly dropouts, being trained to be able to, go into the jobs that are needed by our employers.
And Representative Huberty, we've mentioned HB5 here, but for those who don't know, why don't you explain that legislation?
Sure. Chairman Aycock, Jimmy Dunn Aycock, at the chairman of public education in the state of Texas, last 2 sessions, authored that bill in 2013, the 83rd session. And basically the premise behind it is that people were pretty mad about the amount of tests that they had to take. We had 15 end-of-course tests that we were requiring our high school students to take, and HB5 reduced it down to 5 tests. At the same time, it created a pathway, if you will, five different pathways that could be taken, with a foundation program based on 22 credits, and then obviously the enhanced version of 26 credits. But basically what it did is it said to our students, and what Greg mentioned was counselors, because that was one of the things when we did HB5, I think we all came back in the next session and we tried it, and it's all based on funding. It's all based on formulas and funding and how much money you can get into that. But that was the one criticism that we had from the school districts, was that you didn't give us enough counselors, because we're getting these kids in 8th grade that are theoretically supposed to be picking a path, and we got too many kids. We can't give them the right guidance, and we can't give them the right direction along the way. And so we tweaked some of that last session, and we know as we come back in the next session, that certainly is going to be one of the things that we're going to have to do. But it was a holistic change from where we had been and where we were going, which was everybody needs to go to college, to put the brakes on and say, you know what, maybe not. Because it's almost to the point where what we're seeing is that, when you have 2 kids playing in the pool and one swimming ahead of the other one, you always have the other kid grabbing their leg and pulling them back. That's what was happening to our kids. We said, well, let's let those kids go and be successful. And the kid that needs additional help and additional guidance, let's make sure we get them in the right path. And that path may be career and technical education, but it may also be we need to make sure that we give them additional work and support to be able to move into a path that would make some sense for them to be able to do that. And so the success of that has been, is what we've seen, is that the graduations rates have continued to increase. Now, if you look at it and say that, the kids that we've got, kids that are, this will be the last year for it, that have gone through that, taking the, requirement of the 15 tests, the juniors and seniors, we saw last session that we were going to have somewhere around 28,000 kids that would not be able to graduate because of that. And Senator Seliger and I worked on a bill, Senate Bill 149, to be able to allow those students to be able to graduate based on some graduation criteria that we established. But I think that as what Chairman Aycock did was remarkable in the sense that we got all the different groups together, and I know that the Chamber was involved, and Texas Association of Business was involved, and TAMSA was involved. I mean, everybody and their brother was involved in that piece of legislation because it was important. It was important to get everybody's input. We weren't going to make everybody happy. We knew that. We knew that wasn't the end goal. The end goal was to be able to get kids learning again in the classroom, learning real data and real material that can help them be successful, and not worrying about taking a stupid test, which is ultimately what it came down to. So I think that was a big change as we looked at our system. And so, we're proud of the TEKS, we're proud of what we're teaching, and so we want to make sure that our teachers are able to teach, and that provided flexibility in the classroom.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for telling us more about that. And I think that's an important point, is helping students reach high school graduation is very important. There's a lot of national research that shows the lifetime average earnings of a high school graduate versus a dropout are in the ballpark of about $300,000 more than a dropout. And certainly when you look at the cost to society, incarceration, public assistance programs, it's a very meaningful thing to get them to that milestone. And also we've talked about some of the initiatives to get them that middle skill level training, but focusing more on some of the problems and how education is really linked to recidivism and some of those issues. There's a link is really kind of born out of data, and it shows that dropouts are 3.5 times more likely to be arrested than high school graduates. And nationwide, 68% of all males in prison do not have a high school diploma. So just wanted to talk about what kind of impact can education have in assisting to stem the tide of incarceration and engagement in helping to reduce recidivism. And I know that Representative, there's a project, a pilot that you've been working on with Wyndham Schools.
Yeah, so, for those of you who don't know, Wyndham Schools is kind of like the school of last resort, right? And working with our very troubled youth. You've got different levels within the schools that, you got ISS, and you've got, in JJAP, which, if we got a really problematic kid that is always in trouble, because, kids are getting arrested at 15 and 16 and 17 years of age, and they're going to jail. But at the same time, we still have an obligation to educate them, right? Because if we don't, what we're going to get is what you just talked about. They're going to be one of that 68%. And so, one of the things we looked at and said, instead of just getting a GED, they're able to get a diploma from the Wyndham School, and that was important for them to be able to do that. They're not properly funded. We've looked at how do we look at that from a funding perspective. The Texas military forces, we also have a couple military academies that have been extremely successful in these very, very, very troubled youth, and putting them into a military type environment, military school type environment, versus putting them in jail. And so, those are things that we continue to work on. But, you've got a large population of kids that are in trouble and are in jail or headed towards jail. And it's a cycle, right? It's a continuous cycle. And you can peg and look at, their family history and things of that nature and say, okay, after they've gotten themselves in trouble, how do we stop this cycle from continuing to happen? And part of it is creating a path and getting engagement and getting somebody that actually cares about the kid. That in and of itself makes a huge difference. That somebody actually gives a crap about this kid and wants to help them, and whether it's a counselor, or it's a coach, or it's somebody that recognizes that we need to be able to take care of them. And right, wrong, or indifferent, I can't tell you. I go to political events, and I listen to people, and people get in my face about we shouldn't provide free lunches for people, or we shouldn't do this for these kids or anything else. And I said, well, you think about it, and there's groups out there that we need to protect. We need to protect our disabled. This is a Dan Patrick line, but this is true. We need to protect our disabled, our military, our foster children, and our kids from their idiot parents, right? So, the reality is that we have got to do a better job of identifying and helping these kids, and whether, making sure that they're getting, a meal during the day. And I know that a lot of people may say, well, why do we do that? Well, because you're either going to pay for it now or you're going to pay for it later, right? And so if we can continue to improve the graduation rate by all these things that we're doing, and and identifying and saying how, what path can we help you go? Where can we help you so that you can actually get out of high school and get a job and be a productive member of society versus, we're going to spend about $50,000 a year for every person that's incarcerated in the state of Texas. And chances are when they get out, they're going to continue, their life of crime associated with that. So, we have an obligation and responsibility to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Greg, how does this impact the workforce boards?
Well, just to answer your question about, what is the link between, I guess, education and the issue of recidivism. I have a hard time saying that word. Yeah. I go back to, it's a job, it's employment. And we've been talking, and I would add to that a good job. A decent, paying job. And we've talked here today about what the strong link is between education, and a good job. And I say that because, quite honestly, some of the minimum wage jobs, it might be, a life of crime might be more lucrative. So I think that really we are talking about good jobs and the education that's required to put these individuals, into those positions. Again, I think, once you get them into jobs, or even at the early stage, that they're able to make the transition, for ex-offenders, coming out, that, one, you're providing them with some sort of opportunity out there, but you're also, giving them something to do and keeping them off the streets. And I think, that's very important. I think, we need to look at such things. I know we talked about legislative recommendations a little while ago. I know that the Capital Area Board here in Austin has actually, I think, made a recommendation that, when it comes to this issue of ex-offenders and reducing recidivism, that we also, try to, remove barriers, which would, barriers to these individuals having access to employment opportunities, such as, I think, the requirements that, state requirements that ex-offenders have certain, or really are not able to, if they have, to be able to gain licensures for certain occupations. And we talked about different industry certifications. Well, I think there's a lot of barriers for ex-offenders that just, they don't have access to that because they've made a mistake at one point in their life. So I know that that's one of the things that they've recommended taking a look at. And I know, beyond that too, we have different boards. There are all kinds of best practices out there and great ideas. They're being done at the local level, by our local workforce boards, along with all of their partners and our community college partners, with our, contractor partners. They abound out there, and a lot of these programs are not necessarily state initiatives, but it's just whatever the business community and the community leaders, decide to do in terms of how they can be involved and go into the jails, for example. I think, I've heard that the Greater Dallas Board is actually taking some of their adult basic education efforts, inside the county jail. And I know that, that you can find some level of that type of effort. You're probably just about at any one of the 28 regions where they're trying to, again, incorporate, the programs they have and leverage those, the funding for their programs against those provided by other departments to wherever we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck.
Drew, what are some of your thoughts in the chamber on education and incarceration?
I think these two gentlemen have said it very well. I don't have anything better to say.
Thank you. Well, got about 10 minutes left, so I'd love to open it up for some Q&A from the audience. There'll be some mics going around, so if there's any questions please raise your hand and someone should be able to give you a mic.
Thank you. How do we make this topic more appealing? I mean, the room is not full this afternoon, but yet this is a major problem. So how can we, in the education sector and also in the community, shine light on this as something that we need to be paying attention to?
Representative?
You know, I didn't see what panels we're up against, but I know it's almost cocktail hour, so that could be part of the problem. You know, it's funny. You know, those of us that specialize or focus a lot on education, you know, we see the same people at our committee meeting rooms all the time, right? You know, the people that really care about it and are concerned about it. You know, everybody wants a good education. Everybody wants good skilled workforce. Everybody wants that stuff, but it's not sexy, right? You know, it's not the exciting stuff that would happen at a South by Southwest conference, I suppose. But this is the reality of it. You know, the reality is that you know, this is what the people that actually are here and the people that are in this room and that actually care about it, you know, we have to do the heavy lifting. You know, we're the ones that are going to have to do this work. And the guys that are here, and Drew, and as much as he and I butt heads a lot, the guys at every meeting, you know, he cares. You know, I know you care, you know, and that's important. And when we lose people like that, that's going to make a difference. I don't think there's anything you can do about hanging a banner or anything else and say, oh, please come into our public education committee meeting, because half the time people fall asleep and of what we talk about, because it's tough to watch the sausage get made, right? But this is a real problem. We've made a lot of progress along the way, but it's just it's like, you know, building a road. People say, oh, you know, the road's built, great. When did that happen? You know, so we have to just continue. You know, you know, people like you and everybody else that are in the room have to continue to show up and get your information out there and. You know, I think for those of you that know and surround yourself around the legislative process, at least in the state of Texas, know that is not a focus for many members, other than if their superintendent calls them and they want something done. You know, it's a very small, select group of individuals that deal with the complex issues, because they are complex and they are difficult to deal with. And oh, by the way, you know, they're not. From time to time, they can get difficult to deal with, and so you know, the safe thing to do is to sometimes stay away. So I would continue, you know, encouraging people to continue to be involved as we move into the next legislative session. This is certainly something that's important and critical. Graduation rates are critical, but more important, because we focus, our graduation rates are up. You know, we're at 88%. All right, where are those other 12% kids? Where did they go? And how do we go get them back? And so the work that these guys are doing with the young adults and even adults, you know, 3 million other people. You know, you know, there's what you said, 33 million people who don't have college or high school degrees in the country. 3 million of them, or 3.3 million of them, live in Texas. 10%. We have 10% of the. It's an alarming statistic. It is a huge problem. And we just have to continue, you know, talking to your elected officials and your representatives to continue to get them to stay engaged in this issue.
Anything else to add?
That's probably the $1 million question. You know, and I think we're all, you know, any organization I've ever worked with, where we talk about how do we raise awareness out there, particularly among, you know, those key groups, and how do we, you know, as I've talked about here today, how do we better, you know, engage the business community? You know, I was a chamber executive in my former life, and now they only let people with, you know, intelligence level of Drew remain in that, so I had to go on to something else.
That's not a high level.
But, you know, and they're doing tremendous work at the Austin Chamber, but I think every chamber out there, you know, has an education committee. So I'm a little bit partial to this issue because I used to be in that profession. They all have an education committee, and so I think, you know, hopefully, as we talked about this alignment, maybe one day when we talk about education and workforce development, almost being, you know, redundancy of terms out there, that the two are synonymous. So, you know, I think that's where you start in a local community, to where you at least start to engage, you know, the business people, is through your local chamber, and just so many best practices out there. So whether that's, getting with the chamber and how we raise awareness of it, that's one of the things we're trying to do as an association too. Every meeting we talk about all of these great things that are being done and how do we start to put some of these ideas or these stories to paper or to computer screen or whatever it may be today in order to not only help each other, but they also help, better tell our story. So I think, as we're telling those stories, everything always comes back to, an individual, either an individual or a business that had an issue, had a problem in terms of finding, qualified workers, of a community that was looking to locate an industry and how they worked, with the chamber and the economic development agency and their workforce partners to solve that problem, or of a job seeker, or maybe it was even a high school dropout, how they were able to access the services that are available to them. I think those are the types of stories that the more we access those and figure out how to spread them around, that ultimately, will improve understanding and awareness of what we're trying to do and the importance of the issues.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll have time for one or two more questions right there.
All right. So families are incredibly important for the success of children in school and in life. So what is being done to reach out to parents and to families and to help them support their kids and identify careers and understand that it's very important to stay in school and graduate and go on?
Yeah, so we've, and Gilbert Zavala, who's here, has helped to run this effort. We've had for a decade an effort to try and increase college enrollment. And we survey students in their junior year, figure out where they want to go after high school, top 3 choices, et cetera, et cetera. And then what happens during that student's senior year is that they will get reminders. Hey, Drew, UT Austin will be here on Thursday. Click here to register. Hey, Drew, you haven't submitted to Texas State. Deadline is in 3 weeks. So February 1, for the first time, we've gotten parents so that they can now receive text messages just for their kids as well. Very strong take-up rate. I think we've got, we'll just say 10,000 parents, and only 9 of them opted out and said, I don't want this information, which was great. What I think we can do with this beyond that is start to impact some of the course decisions or endorsement decisions, is use this as an additional communication technique with parents in a very complicated world. And I don't know if you're disappointed. I am disappointed that school districts have not resourced counseling since House Bill 5. And so we've been trying to come up with technology that can help inform these really important decisions that 13-year-olds are having to make. And I think that's a promising approach that we're trying to learn a lot from.
Anything to add on that?
All I would say is that, parental involvement is critical at every stage of education. When we talked about, last session, we had our pre-K bill with HB 4, a parental involvement plan was part of the key to getting the additional funding. And we remind that time and time and time again. It's obviously, there are some issues demographically based, based on the school. You go to a PTA meeting, like at my school district, I look at it and say I go to a PTA meeting at, Bear Branch Elementary in Kingwood, you got, 50, 60, 70 moms. You go to a PTA meeting, if there even is a PTA at Humble Elementary or someplace like that, not so much, So, and because it's a difference because a lot of those parents are working, single families, things of that nature. So, but we've got to change the mindset. The mindset has become over the last several years, and this is really a societal issue. They're dropping the kids out, kicking them out the door, putting them on a bus or whatever, and then the school district gets to raise the kid for 9 hours, right? And then maybe they go to a daycare center or they go home and they're not, there's nothing at home along those lines as well. So, it is a continuous problem. So the counselors are going to help. Getting people to care about those kids is going to help. And continuing to work, for the effort of making sure that we find a way to engage those kids, because that really is going to be the success. I think that we can continue to see, and it's a process, and we know that it's a process. You can't make parents want to be a good parent. You can only encourage them. You can encourage the kid, and then put programs in place at these schools to identify these at-risk kids, and then figure out a way to help them.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it looks like we're just about to wrap up now with our time. So just want to thank the panelists so much. I thought we had a really interesting discussion today on the opportunities in Texas to help keep it as one of the leaders in the country and help fill jobs with very qualified, skilled laborers, and help bring back students who've dropped out and help them find ways to get a high school diploma and job training. So thank you so much for our panelists, and thanks for the
Thank you.
audience.
Thank you.